They called me dead weight. I left a note, then shut off everything they took for granted. I never thought I'd hear my own daughter call me dead weight. Not in front of my grandchildren, not with that cold finality in her voice. But she did. And in that moment, something in me simply broke. My name is Marjorie Latham. I'm 67 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one everyone relied on. When my husband, Walter, passed away, I sold my little bakery in Ashland, Oregon, packed up my grief, and moved in with my daughter, Elaine, to help her raise her 2 kids. I paid for the mortgage when her husband lost his job. I kept the lights on, the fridge full, the kids clothed. I told myself that was what family did. We took care of each other. But over time, that debt of gratitude twisted into entitlement. They stopped thanking me. They started expecting. And when I began to slow down, my knees stiffening, my hands aching from arthritis, they decided I was no longer useful. Just one more burden. It all came to a head on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the Oregon drizzle never quite stops. Elaine was in the kitchen, her voice low, but her words sharp enough to slice through the thin wall between us. She's dead weight, Todd. She can't even drive anymore. She's just sitting here, taking up space. Todd didn't argue. He never did. He just sighed, as if the topic exhausted him, like I was the reason he woke up every day resentful. I pressed my palm to my mouth to keep from making a sound. My heart felt like it was folding in on itself. After everything, after all the years of sacrificing, of showing up when no one else would, this was what I was reduced to. Dead weight. I spent that afternoon moving in slow motion, folding laundry, wiping down counters, trying to pretend I hadn't heard. But every time Elaine walked by me without making eye contact, every time Todd huffed about the bills I had already paid, I felt a strange clarity begin to crystallize inside me. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew that if I did, the bitterness would swallow me whole. That evening, after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. My pen hovered over the first line of a letter I never thought I'd write. You once called me your rock. Now you call me dead weight. So I'm setting us both free. I didn't cry as I wrote. I think I'd cried enough for one lifetime. Instead, I felt something close to peace, like the first deep breath after holding it too long. I knew I couldn't leave without making sure I wouldn't be their safety net anymore. Over the years, I'd been added to every account, utilities, credit cards, even the house deed, because they needed my credit. My name was the reason their life hadn't collapsed already. I was the unacknowledged guarantor of their comfort. So before the sun rose, I picked up the phone and started making calls. To the bank, to the credit card companies, to the mortgage lender. One by one, I began closing the doors I'd once opened for them. When the last account was frozen, I felt lighter than I had in decades. It wasn't revenge, it was self-respect. Before dawn, I placed the letter on the kitchen counter, right next to the coffee maker. I set my keys beside it, a silent punctuation mark to everything I was about to leave behind. Then I walked out into the damp Oregon morning, my suitcase rolling behind me, and didn't look back. Because sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the people who broke you fend for themselves. The early morning air bit at my cheeks as I stood waiting for the bus into town. I hadn't used public transportation in years, not since before Walter died. But that morning, I felt more capable than I had in a long time. I boarded with my suitcase and settled into a seat near the back, where no one could see the trembling in my hands. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of Elaine's porch, wind chimes swaying gently in the drizzle. For a moment, I wondered if she'd already found my letter, if she'd even read past the first line before crumpling it up in disgust. But I forced myself to look away. I had done what I needed to do. There was no going back. I spent that day in a small cafe on Main Street, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. My phone vibrated again and again, calls, voicemails, text messages that started polite and quickly turned frantic. Mom, what did you do? You can't just cut everything off. Call me back now. I switched the phone off. For once, their emergencies weren't mine to solve. By early afternoon, I'd found a room at a modest motel on the outskirts of town. The place smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, but the sheets were clean and the door locked. I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself to exhale, really exhale, for the first time in years. I thought about Walter, how he used to say I gave too much, that I didn't know when to draw the line. He would have been proud of me, maybe a little surprised too. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with a local attorney. Her office was tucked inside a converted craftsman bungalow with cheery blue shutters. I told her everything: how my name had been leveraged to prop up Elaine and Todd's life, how I'd drained my savings to keep them afloat. She listened without judgment, then folded her hands over my file. "Mrs. Latham, it sounds like you've been more than generous. You've protected them long enough. You have every right to reclaim your independence." Her words felt like a balm. I hadn't realized how starved I was for validation, how much I needed someone, anyone, to say I wasn't being cruel. We spent the afternoon sorting through paperwork. She helped me formalize the removal of my name from the property deed, finalize account closures, and ensure no lingering debts could find their way back to me. Every signature felt like shedding another heavy layer. When I left her office, I felt different, lighter, yes, but also unmoored. For 67 years, my life had been defined by who needed me: my husband, my daughter, my grandchildren. Without that, who was I supposed to be? I stopped by the public library on the way back to the motel, partly because I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't my small, silent room. I wandered the aisles with no real purpose until my eyes fell on a display of travel guides: Washington, Arizona, California, places I'd once dreamed of visiting but had always put off for someday. Someday was here. There was no one left to wait for. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain tap against the window. In my mind, I could picture Elaine's face when she realized she couldn't access the accounts, when she understood that I had really left. Maybe she'd be furious, maybe she'd feel betrayed, but maybe, just maybe, she'd see that this wasn't about punishment. It was about finally loving myself enough to walk away. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but for the first time in a long time, I was curious to find out. The following morning, I woke up earlier than I meant to, the motel room still dark, except for the pale glow of the parking lot lights seeping through the curtains. My phone remained off on the nightstand, a silent witness to all the messages I knew were waiting. I sat up slowly, stretching my back until the stiffness eased. For a moment, I simply sat there, feeling the strangeness of it. No one calling my name, no voices demanding breakfast, or errands, or explanations. Just me, alone with the quiet I'd once feared, but now realized I craved. I decided to take a walk. The drizzle had lifted, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining. I wandered along Main Street, passing the hardware store, the antique shop, the little florist with its buckets of sunflowers out front. When had I last noticed any of these things? Living in Elaine's house, my life had shrunk down to the size of their needs. A woman about my age was arranging a window display in the florist's shop. She looked up and gave me a small, warm nod, like she saw me, really saw me as a person and not a burden. I almost cried from that simple kindness. Back at the motel, I made a list of everything I needed to do. Not for them, for me. It was the first list in decades that didn't have anyone else's name on it. 1. Find a small apartment. 2. Look into part-time work. 3. Consider visiting California. 4. Sign up for a senior community center. I underlined the last one twice. I'd spent so long being indispensable that I'd forgotten how to be connected, to have friendships, to be part of something that wasn't transactional. By midday, I finally turned my phone back on. The notifications poured in like a flood. There were dozens of calls from Elaine, a handful from Todd, even 2 from my grandson Trevor, though I suspected his mother had forced him to dial my number. I didn't answer any of them, but I did listen to the last voicemail Elaine left. Her voice was shrill with panic. "Mom, you can't just disappear like this. We need you to fix this. None of the bills are paid, the mortgage is overdue, and the credit cards are frozen. You can't do this to us. You're being selfish." Selfish. The word echoed in my chest, but this time it didn't hurt the way it once would have, because for the first time in my life I was being selfish, and it felt like survival. I deleted the voicemail and set the phone back down. That afternoon, I took a taxi to a small complex on the other side of town, a row of tidy brick apartments with planters outside each door. The manager, a kind woman named Denise, walked me through a unit that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. It was small, just 1 bedroom, but it had sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and a little patio where I could put a chair and read. I signed the lease before I could talk myself out of it. When Denise handed me the keys, my hands trembled again, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was relief. As I stood in the empty living room, I realized that everything I'd just done, the closed accounts, the letter, the leaving, it wasn't an ending. It was the start of something I hadn't believed I'd ever have again, a life that belonged only to me. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the apartment, even though it was already spotless. I think I just needed to prove to myself that I could care for something, and for once, that something was me. That evening, when the sky turned pink behind the trees, I sat on my little patio and watched the world go on without me needing to hold it up. It was humbling, and it was beautiful. The first night in my new apartment, I slept with the windows cracked open. The breeze carried in the scent of pine and damp earth, and I lay in bed listening to the rustle of leaves. It struck me how long it had been since I'd heard anything other than the clatter of other people's needs. In the morning, I made coffee and sat cross-legged on the floor, my mug cupped in my hands. I had no furniture yet, just a suitcase and a folded blanket. But for all its emptiness, the space felt more like home than Elaine's house ever had. I spent that week slowly setting up my life. Denise, the apartment manager, helped me find a secondhand shop with a decent sofa and a kitchen table. I bought new sheets, bright yellow ones that made me smile every time I looked at them, and a little radio to keep me company. One afternoon, I walked to the local community center. A cheerful woman at the front desk told me about their activities: watercolor classes, yoga, potlucks. My heart ached at how much I'd missed without realizing it. I signed up for everything I could, not because I was desperate to fill the hours, but because for the first time in years, I could choose how to spend them. On my way back, my phone buzzed. Another message from Elaine. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. Mom, we're trying to get everything sorted, but the utilities are threatening to shut off, and the mortgage company says the payment is overdue again. You need to come back and fix this. I don't know how to do any of it without you. I stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, letting the words sink in. For so long, I'd believed that my worth was tied to what I could solve. But now I could see it clearly. They'd never learned to take responsibility because I had always absorbed every consequence. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I started a journal, a practice the woman at the community center recommended. At first it felt silly, but once I started writing, I couldn't stop. The pages filled with memories I hadn't thought about in years. Summers with Walter, the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in my old shop, the way Trevor used to crawl into my lap when he was little. Remembering those moments reminded me that my life had been full of love and purpose. Just because Elaine and Todd couldn't see it, didn't mean it wasn't real. Later that week, I got a call from my grandson. I let it go to voicemail, but his message was softer than his mother's had been. Grandma, Mom says you're not coming back. I don't really understand everything, but I miss you. I hope you're okay. For the first time, my heart cracked a little. Because I did love him. But loving someone doesn't mean you have to sacrifice yourself over and over. I could care about Trevor without stepping back into the life that had drained me dry. I closed my eyes and whispered a promise into the quiet. I'm still your grandmother. I'll always love you. But I have to love myself too. That night I cooked myself a real meal, just for me. Pasta with fresh basil from the little pot I'd bought for my windowsill. I set the table, lit a candle, and sat down alone. And it wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. When I blew out the candle and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. For the first time in years, I looked like someone I recognized, a woman who knew her own worth, even when no one else did. The following weeks passed in a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Mornings were slow and unhurried, coffee on the patio, the local paper spread across my lap. Sometimes I walked to the little park on the edge of town, where the geese gathered near the pond. I'd sit on a bench and watch them glide across the water, feeling my shoulders drop just a little more each day. At the community center, I found myself drawn to watercolor painting. I wasn't very good, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I was doing something simply because it made me happy. No one else benefited from it, and no one demanded I be perfect. In those classes, I met other women my age: Nancy, who had recently lost her husband, and June, who'd left an unkind marriage after 40 years. We started sitting together after class, swapping stories over sandwiches from the corner deli. We were all women who had given too much, too long, and now, in our own ways, we were learning to reclaim what remained. One afternoon, as we sat under a sprawling maple tree outside the center, Nancy turned to me and asked, "Do you ever regret it? Walking away?" I looked out over the lawn, thinking of Elaine's last voicemail, of the life I'd left behind. "No," I said finally. "I regret waiting so long." It was the truth. I had spent decades believing that love required endless sacrifice, that my needs were selfish, that my worth was measured by how much I could endure. But now, sitting in the sunshine with women who understood, I realized that letting go hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the start. A week later, Denise called to tell me a package had arrived. I hesitated before going to the office to collect it. My name was scrawled across the top in Elaine's handwriting. Inside, I found a stack of envelopes, bills, notices, some already stamped past due. No note, no apology, just silent evidence of the life I'd left behind. I carried the package back to my apartment and set it on the kitchen table. For a moment, I felt the old guilt trying to rise, the reflex to fix everything. But I didn't open the envelopes. I didn't call Elaine. Instead, I picked up the package, walked out to the dumpster, and dropped it in. Standing there in the warm afternoon, I felt something release inside me, a final thread snapping loose. They were going to have to figure out their own lives without leaning on me like a crutch. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at a little Italian place I'd always wanted to try. The hostess asked if I was waiting for someone, and I smiled when I said, "No, it's just me tonight." And it was enough. When the waiter brought the check, he left a slice of tiramisu on the house. "Just because," he said with a kind smile. As I tasted the first spoonful, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something this small and joyful for myself. On the walk home, I passed the florist's shop again. The woman in the window recognized me and gave me a wave. I felt a strange warmth in my chest, like I was finally part of my own life, instead of a shadow in someone else's. That night, before I went to bed, I opened my journal and wrote, "Today, I did not save anyone but me, and it was enough." I closed the book, turned out the lamp, and slept with the window open, the cool Oregon breeze reminding me that the world was so much bigger than the narrow life I'd left behind. A month had passed since I left Elaine's house, though it felt both longer and shorter in ways I couldn't quite explain. Some mornings I still woke up expecting to hear the muffled arguments, the hurried footsteps, the constant background noise of other people's chaos. But all I heard was the gentle hush of the trees outside my window, and the quiet felt like a gift. One afternoon, I was painting in the community center when June tapped me on the shoulder. "Someone's here asking for you," she murmured, her eyes gentle. My heart stuttered. For a moment, I wondered if it was Trevor, maybe Elaine. Part of me even hoped it was, some small proof that maybe they finally understood why I'd left. But when I walked out to the lobby, it wasn't my daughter or grandson waiting. It was Todd. He looked thinner than I remembered, like the burden of all those unpaid bills had finally settled onto his shoulders. His eyes flicked around the room before landing on me. "Marjorie," he said, his voice weary, "can we talk?" I crossed my arms over my paint-streaked apron. "About what?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Elaine. She's having a hard time. The house is close to foreclosure. The utilities are behind. She's angry, but she's scared too." "I imagine she is," I said, keeping my tone even. "She'll have to figure it out." His eyes widened a little, like he couldn't believe I was serious. "You can't just let everything fall apart." "I'm not letting anything fall apart," I corrected quietly. "I'm just not holding it together anymore." Todd ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You don't have to come back, but could you at least help her get things settled?" I took a slow breath. The old Marjorie would have folded. The old Marjorie would have reached for her checkbook or called the mortgage company to fix everything. But that woman didn't live here anymore. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "But this is something she needs to learn to handle. I can't do it for her." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he nodded once, almost to himself. I guess I knew you'd say that." He left without another word, and I stood there in the lobby as the door swung shut behind him. For a moment I felt a pang. Guilt, maybe. Or simply the ache of knowing I'd finally drawn a line I wouldn't erase. Back in the painting room, June watched me carefully. "You okay?" I sank onto the stool, wiping my palms on my apron. "I think so. It's just hard. loving someone and knowing you can't save them from themselves. She laid a gentle hand over mine. That's the bravest kind of love. That evening, I went home and pulled out the stack of travel guides I'd borrowed from the library weeks earlier. For years, I'd put off every dream, telling myself there would be time later. But later kept slipping further away. I flipped open the California guide and traced my finger down the page until I landed on Monterey Bay. I'd always wanted to see the ocean again. The next morning, I booked a ticket. Not because I was running away, but because, for the first time, I was choosing something just for me. When I finished packing, I looked around the apartment, my apartment, and felt a rush of quiet pride. Every picture on the wall, every dish in the cupboard, every bright yellow pillow on the sofa was something I had chosen. Not for Elaine, not for Todd, not even for Trevor. For me. I left a note with Denise, just in case someone came looking again. All it said was, "I'm fine, please don't worry," and I meant it. As the bus pulled away the next morning, I watched the town shrink behind me. The florist shop, the community center, the quiet street lined with trees. It wasn't an escape, it was a beginning. For the first time in my life, I felt like the weight on my shoulders was my own, and I was finally free to carry it, or set it down, however I chose. The bus ride down the California coast was longer than I expected, but I didn't mind. I watched the scenery shift from pine forests to rolling hills, then finally to the wide sweep of the Pacific Ocean. When we rounded a bend and the water came into view, endless and blue under the afternoon sun, I pressed my hand to the glass like a child. I hadn't seen the ocean in almost 30 years. Not since Walter and I had taken Trevor here as a baby, wrapped in a little blue blanket against the salty breeze. The memory rose in me so clear it felt like it was happening all over again, and for once it didn't hurt. It just felt true, like proof that my life had been full, even if it hadn't ended up the way I'd imagined. I checked into a small inn near Cannery Row, the kind of place with lace curtains and a front desk run by a retired couple who reminded me a little of Walter and me. They gave me a room facing the water and a key on a worn leather fob. No electronic codes, no apps, just something solid I could hold in my palm. That evening, I walked down to the shore. The sun was low, turning the water into liquid gold. I slipped off my shoes and let the surf wash over my feet, icy and clean. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt and the wind, and for the first time in years there was nothing waiting for me to fix. No responsibilities clawing at my spine, just the quiet miracle of standing exactly where I wanted to be. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. Another voicemail from Elaine, the preview line flickering across the screen. "I hope you're happy." I thought about all the years I'd spent twisting myself into knots to make sure she never felt abandoned. All the ways I'd ignored my own exhaustion to prove my love. But the truth was, no amount of sacrifice had ever been enough to make her feel whole. That wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my burden to carry. I powered the phone down and slid it back into my bag. Then I took another step into the waves, feeling the sand shift under my heels. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and walked the wharf as the fishing boats went out. The gulls screamed overhead, the breeze sharp with salt. I bought a cup of coffee and watched the pink dawn spread across the sky. It felt like a promise, that there was still time to live a life of my own making. Later that day, I visited the Monterey Bay Aquarium, another thing I'd always meant to do someday. I wandered the exhibit slowly, pausing in front of the great tank where the kelp swayed in the currents. Schools of silver fish shimmered in the blue light, moving in perfect harmony. They didn't need my help to survive. They just existed exactly as they were meant to. Standing there, I finally understood. I didn't have to be essential to someone else's life to be worthy of my own. My value wasn't measured in how much I could give or how much I could endure. It was enough just to be here, to breathe, to witness the world with my own eyes. When I left the aquarium, I sat on a bench overlooking the bay and pulled out my journal. In the margin of a fresh page, I wrote, "I am not dead weight. I am alive, and I am free." I closed the book and lifted my face to the sun. For the first time in decades, I felt unburdened, like every step ahead belonged to me alone. When I finally returned to my inn that evening, the woman at the front desk asked if I'd enjoyed my day. I smiled, really smiled, and said, "Yes, more than I ever expected." As I turned the key in the lock of my little room, I realized I wasn't just closing the door on the past. I was opening it to everything still waiting. And in that quiet, golden hour, I knew I was no longer waiting for someone else to give me permission to live. I already had.